understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is podcast time, and John is not only confused, but he's very anxious. He's an anxious...
Confused and anxious is a regular state for me, actually.
It's almost like, it's a regular state for you, but you're more confused, more anxious, more worried about the world than I've seen you for a long, long time.
Yeah, and I'm still off Twitter. I went onto Twitter the other day and my anxiety shot up again. So it's poison. Twitter is poison. But here's the thing. Talking to a lot of people, a lot of my mates and my kids, and there is this palpable rise in anxiety. Every time you turn on the news, Trump is saying something else that's kind of crazy, that's kind of hard to get your head around. For instance, attacking Zelensky and calling him a dictator and just repeating all the Russian propaganda. And I hear a lot of people asking, like, why is he doing this? And in the way he's doing it, like pissing everybody off, cutting ties or trying to cut ties with long-standing allies and all that kind of stuff. It's really hard to make sense of this. And then, of course, when he's talking about the US being taken for a ride by the rest of the world and everyone ripping them off, like, is that really the case?
Okay, well, I think you've put your finger on something. So today's podcast, John, we're going to explain the logic behind the MAGA economics.
Yeah.
We're going to revisit a very old economic idea called mercantilism, which is the basis of MAGA economics. We're going to look at the various different tariffs that Trump has imposed. We're going to explain what the next move is likely to be. We're going to explain why Ireland is extremely exposed. And then finally, John, to give you a little bit of succor, a little bit of rest.
Oh, good. Oh,
a little bit
God.
of... This is all my, almost like economic Valium I'm going to give you. I'm going to mainline Valium into you. So you're going to be absolutely chill this afternoon, right?
All right, great.
I'm going to explain to you why economics, this beautiful, bizarre, complicated science, pseudoscience, theory, idea, whatever we choose to call it, why economics will come possibly to the rescue and your anxiety levels may decrease. Because economics, as I've always said, is a bullshit detector, right? Economics is a bullshit detector. And if the policies are not coherent, the economy very quickly puts manners on a movement. So what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about when MAGA smashes in to monetary economics at the end. Yeah. And monetary economics always wins. Why? Because money, as a fellow who wrote a book about it, will tell you it is a weapon more sulfurous and more potent than ideology, than religions, than armies, than wars, than all those things that are being spewed out of the mouth of the likes of Trump, Vance, Putin, and all these geezers.
Okay, let's get into this then. Because
but don't worry, I know your cousins are trying to emigrate and get their passports and get back from Irish America back to Ireland. I know there's lots of anxiety.
They are. There's, and I believe that there's kind of the beginnings of a mass exodus, particularly from California, of Irish Americans.
Right. Well, a mass exodus in John's book is an email from his cousin. But we'll take that, okay, as the beginning. Speaking of mass exoduses, we're going to end this podcast, John, on a mass extinction event, which is upcoming in financial markets, and will, speaking of mass, will emasculate the potency of the tech bros. It will, in effect, castrate the tech bros. I'll talk to you about that in a minute.
Right,
too.
Okay.
So we're mixing all sorts of metaphors with castrations, with emasculations, all this sort of thing. But let's get the idea, right? At the core of the MAGA philosophy is this notion that a trade surplus is the be-all and end-all, and that countries that run trade surpluses with America are actually criminal. And countries that run large trade surpluses with America are the enemy, and they are the target. And the question we have to ask is, why is this? And I suppose the bigger answer to your anxiety question is the notion that we've talked about this for many, many years now, the idea that we go through large super cycles. And at the moment, we are now at an inflection point. We're going from one super cycle to another.
Yeah.
And this is why there's so much anxiety. We're going from one worldview that maybe lasted for the last 70 years to another worldview. So we're going from globalization to nationalism. We're going from peace to war. We're going from safety to a lack of safety, from security to insecurity. We're going from status quo to disruption. All those things are happening at once, which is why we are always...
Well, all transitions and changes, people in general don't deal with them particularly well.
This is a big one. This is a really big one. What we're seeing, John, is a massive, massive rupture in what we all thought was the way in which the world worked. And that, I think, is what we've got to basically grasp with over the course of the next few podcasts and over the course of the next few weeks. And we'll take politics, we'll take geography, we'll take economics, we'll take history, we'll do all that sort of stuff. But for now, what I want to explain is the logic of the tariff war, because lots of people like yourself are saying, hold on a second, does this make any sense?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we're going to identify, number one, why do the MAGA guys focus on the trade surplus? And why is Trump so obsessed with it? Is there a history behind it? Is there a theory behind it? Is there a logic behind it? And unfortunately, John, there is. It's called mercantilism. So mercantilism, do you remember we talked about the flight of the Earls and we were in Venice the other day, right?
Yeah.
So mercantilism is the economics of the post-Renaissance world. It is the economics of the beginning of imperialism, and is the economics, ironically, of the gold standard. So it's pre-fiat money, it's pre-decolonization, it is the first period of what they call the commercialization of the world. So when the world opens up, and when I say the world, when the Europeans started to actually colonize the world, when the imperial project started. So we're talking about the flight of the Earls, we said, was the beginning of the British Empire, 1601 to 1610 and thereafter, right? So it's the economics. But what is it about? So mercantilism in the modern context is the following, John, and I'll tell you where it comes from. If you ever had the misfortune of having to forecast GDP in a country, which I did when I was young in the central bank, you basically were driven by a relationship. So all economic students will remember this: C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So that means that is what GDP is, John, right?
Right, okay.
So C is consumption.
Yeah.
C plus I is investment, plus G is government spending, plus X is exports, minus M minus imports. So if you look at that relationship, that truism, that is basically how GDP is forecast, assessed in macroeconomic models at its basic essence. So you add up all the consumption, and then you take all the investment in an economy, then you take all the government spending, and then you take all the exports, and then you minus the imports. Now, that's the important bit, because if you're a mercantilist economist, you believe if I can have more exports than I have imports, that will positively add to GDP, and that will raise the GDP number. Now, is that true? Yes, it absolutely is, right?
Okay.
So that's the first thing. But the problem with that is if all countries go towards spending less than the next fella, if all countries obsess about increasing their trade surpluses, well, then who runs a deficit?
Yeah.
And if you don't run a deficit, then you can't, by logic, it's tautologically impossible to run a surplus. So somebody has to run a deficit in a globalized world, right?
Well, hang on a second, though. Like, somebody has to run a deficit. So there's going to be winners and losers. So somebody's at the bottom of the pile, as it were.
No, so this, again, is a mercantilist thing. So if you think, right, if America is running a surplus, who's it running a surplus with? It's running with surplus with a country that can't have a surplus, that has to have a deficit.
Yeah.
So this is the idea that your spending is my income, which is the essence of macroeconomics, okay? That in order for a country to run a large trade surplus, It is therefore selling more than it is buying. If it is selling more than it is buying, somebody is buying more than they are selling.
Yeah.
So somebody has to take up the deficit. So that's why in the aggregate, this idea is a zero-sum game. But we can come up to this in a second.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you where it comes from. So it comes from a period when the European countries began to expand economically. That is a nice way of talking about imperialism. So they began to start conquering the Americans. They began to start trading with Asia. They began to start trading with Africa. They began in particular to start trading with the Far East. How do they do this? This is the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the French, etc., going to Asia, and of course the Spaniards going to America. Now, of course, what imperialism did is it heightened the potential for conflict because it was a land grab. It was a trade route grab. It was, in effect, European countries divvying up the world between themselves. So how did they do this? They did this through the framework of trade. So the British Navy emerged to protect British trade routes. The Spanish Navy emerged to protect Spanish trade routes, French, Dutch, etc. Right?
Yeah.
And the whole idea was a massive arbitrage play. So if you, for example, could finance a ship to go from London around the Cape of Good Hope to Calcutta or to, for example, Borneo, and you could buy nutmeg and you could buy spices and you could buy mahogany and you could buy fine art at a fraction of the price that you could sell it in England or in Holland or in France or wherever, there was a massive arbitrage, right? So it made huge sense to go out and try and acquire all these goods from the Far East, right? The problem was it made even more sense to try and rob those ships as they came back.
Yeah.
All right? So therefore, the navies were in effect set up to protect the commercial bonanza that was trade. And then, of course, when they decided that trade wasn't enough, the Brits and the Dutch and the French and the Spaniards decided, why don't we forget this trading with these fellas? Why don't we just take these places over? And grab all and plunder all the stuff, right?
Yeah.
And therefore...
cut out the middleman.
Exactly. Cut out the middleman. Just take the shit, right?
Yeah.
Now then, what is the economics of this land grab? It's called mercantilism. The idea was that a country will only get strong if it sells more than it buys from foreigners. So it sells more to foreigners than it buys from foreigners. But why was this the case? It was all to do with the monetary system at the time. So the monetary system at the time were largely based, it wasn't the gold standard that we came to know in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but it was it was called a species system. A species is not what we know, which is species, i.e. human beings. Species is a wanky name for gold, silver, and copper.
Right, okay.
At the end of the day, the only way in which a country could expand its money supply and reduce its rate of interest and thus precipitate an increase in investment was if it had an excess of gold over somebody else. So mercantilism was called bullionism, is another word for it, right?
Right.
The idea therefore was that if you trade more than your neighbor will pay you in goods, but if there is a surplus, they'll pay you in gold. And then you will acquire that bullion of gold, then you will hoard that bullion of gold, and then your central bank can print more of your currency and you will increase your money supply. So that was the idea. That was the economic theory. So how do you get to trading more than your neighbor? So I'm thinking, imagine you're French or you're British or you're Spanish or you're Dutch, the big players in the 17th and 18th century global economy. Well, what you do is you say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to put up tariffs against foreign imports, which is exactly what Trump is doing.
Right.
So why are we doing this? We're doing this so that all the resources of our local economy, all the agriculture, all the industry, all the brains are focused on producing stuff. We are going to make foreign stuff more expensive So our lads are less likely to buy the foreign stuff, and therefore tariffs make sense in the context of trying to build up your gold reserves. That's the first thing.
Right.
The second thing is they make sense if you're constantly at war, because the only way you can pay your sailors and your soldiers in the event of a war with your imperial competitor is you pay them with money. And the only way you can do that is if you have the gold to back it.
Yeah.
So that's the second thing. The third thing is all these countries were run basically as aristocratic fiefdoms. So what does mercantilism also require? It requires monopolies. It requires licenses to trade. So what you said is the only people who can import this, that, and the other are, for example, this swanky family, right? And this aristocrat, etc. So what it did was, and this is the key to it, in an effort to isolate the country from competition, it prevented other countries who are more competitive for providing goods to your citizens at a better price.
Yeah.
So in fact, what it did, it enriched the very rich who had the monopoly licenses, and it impoverished the workers because the workers couldn't acquire consumer goods and materials that were lower in price, so their real wages fell. So you have a beautiful, beautiful system to enrich the oligarchy at the very, very top, which should not be lost on your discussions about Trump.
Yes.
So that is mercantilism. It becomes the reigning philosophy of the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century. And then, of course, it comes smashed into the Enlightenment. And part of the Enlightenment was not just a perception of how humans are and whether it was Hobbes versus Rousseau and all the stuff we're going to actually talk about in the book club, but there was also a significant part of the Enlightenment, which was economic enlightenment. So you have Voltaire on the French side, you have Adam Smith on the British side saying, look, economics is part of power. And if we can wrestle power from the oligarchy at the top, from the aristocracy who are being protected by mercantilism, we will create a freer society. So their idea was free trade and a free society and a dissenting society all go together. So mercantilism really, at a certain stage, gives way to free tradeism.
Right.
And free trade is more or less laissez-faire, is more or less the economic philosophy of the 19th century, which we have inherited in certain shapes or form.
Yeah.
So there would have been, John, it's interesting you say, there would have been a massive fight between the old establishment and the new establishment, between mercantilism and free tradeism at the end of the 18th century. It is no surprise, John, that the end of the 18th century also brings the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, all of which were tied up in what was in effect a merchant revolution against the aristocracy and the kings. And philosophically, from an economic perspective, it was free trade against mercantilism.
Right. So that was the kind of the background noise for these revolutions. And the cause of the revolutions?
Maybe the cause, certainly if you think of the Boston Tea Party, which is the spark for the American Revolution, that was all about trade, tariffs. Basically, the Americans said, we are not going to pay tariffs, taxes to the British Crown for tea that's imported from India and China. We do not want to do that. So they deposited all the tea in Boston Harbor, which is the Boston Tea Party, right? So all of these revolutions come against the background noise of a philosophical economic change from mercantilism to more free trade. And the basic idea was that free trade will set people free. That was Adam Smith's idea, right?
So what you're saying then is that Trump is trying to revert back to this mercantilist system.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a, everyone says, oh, Trump is this and that and the other. There is a logic and there is a historical provenance for what he is doing. There is a contemporary macroeconomic reason, which is you boost your exports and that boosts your GDP because imports are seen as what they call a leakage out of the system,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And there is a philosophical tradition, but that philosophical tradition is an imperial tradition. Now, that imperial tradition is exactly what you're seeing in Ukraine now. That basically Trump
Yes.
is behaving to Ukraine with Putin as the Brits and the French were doing when they're dividing up Africa. You know, the same sort
Yeah.
of idea. So there is a philosophy. Now, the reason this is so anxiety-inducing for us is that we tend to be Democrats. We tend to be liberals. We tend to like the idea that the small guy gets a fair crack of the whip, that monopolies are probably bad, that oligarchies are probably there to extract value for a very small minority at the top. So it impedes our sense of justice.
But we're also completely and utterly powerless. I mean, there's nothing we can do about this, you know, except put up our own tariffs, you know, and then it just gets stupid.
Now, let's now look at the reality of tariffs. First thing is, MAGA guys, because they're mercantilists, believe that the countries that run massive trade surpluses with America are criminal. Now, why do they think this? Because Trump has got it into his head that America has always been slightly naive, that America has been open to trade and has been like this kind of cuddly big brother that accepts everybody's stuff. And it's the other nasty countries that have been cheating and free riding on America.
Yeah.
Only somebody who has no sense of the economic history of the last 50 years could say that. The economic history of the last 50 years, led by America, has been to gradually trade away tariffs. So the whole idea, you might have been the World Trade Organization, the GATT, the Uruguay round, these might all be sort of just expressions that people understand, right? All of these have been American-led, not American as the recipients, but America as the active player in reducing trade barriers, so much so that in effect now, despite the fact that Donald Trump believes that there are trade barriers everywhere and they have been set up to ensnare the United States, what actually happened is trade barriers on average between developing countries are different, okay? But between the rich countries, the ones that piss him off, which is us and the Asians and to a small degree some Latin American countries, on average tariffs are around 2%. Now, he has been informed about this in the last while, so he's moved on to something else. But I will just give you one problem for Ireland, John, which is the following. The biggest trade surplus with America per head of population in the world is Ireland.
Really?
So when you ask the average American who is not playing by the rules, who is cheating America, who is flooding America with cheap, dodgy, knockoff imports, etc., highly likely 90% of Americans will say China, because that's the narrative they've been fed. But I will just give you a very sobering figure for Ireland. China, with its population of 1.4 billion, runs an annual trade surplus with the United States of $294 billion, which is a big number. That's about $210 per head of Chinese population. Ireland, with our population of 5.5 million, runs a trade surplus annually of 31 billion with the USA, translating to a trade surplus per head of $5,700 every single year.
Wow.
So our trade surplus per head with America is close to 30 times bigger than China's trade surplus per head with America. That's 30 times, not 3 times, not 13 times, but 3 with a big fat 0 times after it, right? So once the MAGA guys cop onto that, we become their enemy number one. Because Ireland is the biggest trade surplus with America.
My anxiety is going up again.
It's 30 times, we are 30 times more criminal than the Chinese in their heads, right?
But they're all American companies, though.
It doesn't matter. They don't care about that. They just see the mercantilist number at the end. Well, of course, they do care that there are many, many American companies involved in that. And they do care that it's a sort of a laundromat of American money comes in, American products comes in. That makes it even more egregious for them. Because what they say is, number one, you are sinning against the altar of mercantilism, against the creed of mercantilism, and you're doing that with our money, not even your money.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're taking the taxes, and those taxes you were spreading amongst your own people. So you can understand why, to the MAGA guys, we are an example of exactly why they believe the United States has been taken for a ride, because it is. Right?
Right.
Okay.
Smack.
Hopefully the podcast will be banned in America. Remember the podcast was banned in Russia?
Yeah, I think it still is, actually.
It is still banned in Russia. It is still banned in Russia. But now nothing's going to be banned in Russia anymore because we're all on the same side, according to the Americans.
Okay, Magga, my anxiety is going up as we speak with every word that comes out of your mouth. You said you had some soothing words for me, so let's get to that after a bit of this.
Soothing words.
Please.
Okay.
Okay, Max, so we're talking about being in the middle of this massive transition from a free trade society to a more mercantilist style.
Yeah, absolutely.
A throwback from history. So how is this going to play out? And is there any bit of sucker in this for us?
Okay, so in April, John, we will know what the Americans are going to do because they've said on the trade side. But by the way, who knows what the world will look like by April?
Well, that's true.
So somebody must have tapped Trump on the shoulder in the last couple of weeks and said, look, the tariff thing, and well, actually, the rest of the world isn't really free riding on tariffs. But what Trump has come up with is VAT. So VAT, which is, as we know, an indirect tax levied on everything, on services and goods in Europe. Americans don't have VAT.
Yeah.
So Americans have what they call a sales tax. So state by state, if you buy...
It's the same thing though, isn't it?
It's exactly the same thing, except in the United States, a sales tax is levied on stuff, not services. So if you're buying a packet of smokes, or if you're buying a pint, right, it's got sales tax, right? That's why if you go to a restaurant in the States, you have the bill and then the sales tax, so it's always bigger.
Yeah.
But typically it's between about 5 and 10%, varies across American states, right? 5 being the lowest, 10 being the highest, or in and around there. European VAT is levied on everything, as we know, all services, all goods, etc. It's an indirect tax, and it's probably runs on average about 21%. It's 23% here. So Trump has seen this, because if you're an American supplying goods to Europe, you have to pay VAT, right? So Trump has highlighted this and said, oh, look at this. They're charging us 23%. That is a tariff, right?
It's criminal. It's criminal,
right? So at the very least, at the very, very, very least, the American tariffs on Europe will be at least 15 or 20%, right? At the very least, in April. So just steel yourself for that, okay?
Yeah.
That is going to happen.
Yeah, for sure. But is that going to have such a big impact, really?
Well, the interesting thing is Ireland produces drugs to give to the Americans, to sell to the Americans. Drugs are probably the most highly inelastic product. And that means that you need drugs for life, whether they cost you a tenner or 20 quid. People still buy drugs because you don't have a choice, right? If you're buying, for example, drugs for a heart condition or drugs for cancer or whatever, you don't have a choice.
Viagra.
Viagra, you probably do have a choice, John. We will not go down that particular route right now. In fact, we are not only the biggest producer of Viagra in the world, we are also the biggest producer of fake boobs in the world.
Yes, indeed.
So,
and heart stents, I believe.
What I really like about Viagra is the fact that if you go into the Aviva,
it works.
A, it works, and B, if you go into the Aviva and you go to the Jackson, the Aviva, the only ad in the male toilet in the Aviva is a massive ad for Viagra. Okay?
Yeah, that's down to Joe.
Anyway, well, it's brilliant marketing. Anyway, let us go on, right? But the downside for American tariffs is the following. Tariffs will automatically be paid by the American consumer. They will automatically increase the price of all those goods that the tariffs are put on. At the moment, the Americans are putting tariffs on steel and aluminium and all these things which are essential for the construction industry. And the construction industry, as we know, is one of the baseline industries. So looking forward, There's a reason that the bond market has not reacted well to Trump. And the reason is the following. People think, hold on a second, the tariffs will create an environment of higher inflation. Now, the problem with higher inflation is that higher inflation will be used by American workers as the reason to go for higher wages, which
Yes.
makes complete sense,
Yeah.
which is the absolute essential promise of MAGA. Higher wages for the blue-collar worker, for the
Yeah.
average guy.
Yeah.
But higher wages that come from higher inflation will lead the Federal Reserve, which has an inflation target of 2%, to increase interest rates. Increasing interest rates knocks the stuffing out of Wall Street, which is Trump's other main area of support. So it's very clear to me that Wall Street is on a collision course with MAGA because Wall Street wants lower interest rates, which can only come through lower inflation, and MAGA wants higher wages and therefore incomes, which will be prompted by higher inflation. So what you have, I think, at the center is an inconsistent notion because up until now, Trump has been able to, not just Trump, but up until now, actually both the Democrats and the Republicans have always been able to play these two power bases off each other.
Yeah.
Financial elite and the working man. The average American, when you talk to the American, if you look at all the polls for Americans, they don't care about Ukraine. They don't care about the EU.
No.
The average American cares about jobs and actually the price of eggs. That's the big thing. Right? And they care about inflation. So when Trump and Vance talk about Ukraine, it's a very distant thing for Americans, right? What Trump cannot afford is a situation where he loses control of the MAGA narrative and fights only a culture war and doesn't fight an economic war. So what the MAGA movement and what the entire consistency of the Republican Party now is to fight their culture war for their ideologues, of which Vance is one, okay, and stuff he's talking about. And it's anti-woke and it's anti-legislation and it's an anti-DEI and all that stuff. So it's a culture war.
Yeah.
And that's basically driven by fanatics. You know, the reason that Elon Musk and Steve Bannon give Nazi salutes is they believe in a culture war. The average American doesn't believe in this. What they really want is a higher real wage for the working man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if the Trump guys can basically deliver both, which is a culture war and higher real wages, great. But you can only deliver higher real wages if wage increases are higher than inflation. And if you start tariffing, as he said, he's made tariff into a verb, which is a noun, but he's made it into a verb in typical Trump lexicon fashion, then inflation goes up. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I don't think on this issue of Russia that many Americans feel that Russia has suddenly become their friend. The Americans have had 100 years of anti-Russian propaganda, anti-Russian messaging. The average American believes that the commies over there in Moscow are the enemy. What Trump is trying to convince them is that all of a sudden, the commies in Russia are their friends. I don't think Americans believe that. I think it'll be incredibly difficult to sustain this.
But he's taken that position and that narrative as, you know, he is the great peacemaker. And that's something that the Americans over the last 100 years are also very tired of war.
They are tired of wars.
And that resonates. But actually, while he's the great peacemaker, he's also creating the conditions for war outside of America that he doesn't have to be involved in. But he gets the arms market. Everyone will have to buy the arms from America.
Well, I don't know. Why should we buy the arms from America? Europe has a huge arms industry. I mean, the Europeans could just say, well, we're not buying any bloody arms.
Well,
full stop.
That remains to be seen, I suppose.
What he's trying to peddle is a pro-Moscow, think about it, pro-financial elite message. Now, if you look at the Americans are not by nature anti-European. Most Americans have European lineage, right?
Yes.
And Irish Americans and Italian Americans have a very fond sense of the old sod. You know, it could be romantic, it could be nostalgic, but it's a fond sense. Ironically, the only Americans who actually descended from people who came from Russia are overwhelmingly Jewish Americans. And they are maybe the most anti-Russian of all Americans because they associate Russia with anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So there is no constituency in the United States, emotional constituency, for a pro-Russian long-term solution. That's what I'm thinking, right? And I think, is it a winner to be pro-Moscow, anti-European, inflation-inducing, elite-loving? I'm not too sure. I think that at the moment people are confused, but it doesn't strike me as a meaningful consensus around which Americans can rally. That's my sense.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
the final issue, John, is the brotocracy. The brotocracy and the tech bros. Now, the brotocracy and the tech bros are about to witness or suffer a mass extinction event, John. And this is
Really?
going to change dynamics of the la-la land called Silicon Valley, right? So Silicon Valley is
You're not
one
talking about the
of-
asteroid, are you?
I'm not, but I know that's your thing. We can talk about the asteroid, but it's going to be the financial equivalent of an asteroid hitting Silicon Valley. So at the
Right.
moment, everybody is basking in the glory of the Magnificent Seven. Well, they're actually not. Since, ironically, we did the podcast of the Magnificent Seven, but 6 weeks ago, lots of the Magnificent Seven haven't been doing so well, right?
Right. Not so
Now-
magnificent.
They're not so magnificent. They're less than magnificent. But the key thing is to understand that the mass extinction event that is emerging or is going to emerge in Silicon Valley is the extinction of the unicorns. So, do you remember the unicorns? This was all the talk about 4 years ago, before the pandemic, during the pandemic. Interest rates go to zero. You have these things called SPACs, which were
Yeah.
companies set up to buy companies that they hadn't figured out what companies they were just yet. Just give us your money and we'll buy something with it, right? Tens of billions of dollars were invested into companies called unicorns that on paper were valued at more than 1 billion.
Yeah.
And the idea, and this was by tech bros, by sovereign wealth funds, by rich investors, et cetera, et cetera. The idea was that Silicon Valley will produce a conveyor belt of unicorns, and the way in which you as an investor will get out and enrich yourself dramatically, and the tech bros who brought you into this gig, will be through IPOs, initial public offerings, right?
Yes.
The idea was that you'd put your money in for 2 years. These guys would build these fantastic startups. And then 2 or 3 years later, you'd go to Wall Street and you'd say, please float these companies and can we get an exit and get paid as much as possible? Ching, right?
Yeah.
What has happened? Out of the 400 unicorns of the year before the pandemic, how many IPOs have there been? So
Dunno.
this is the class of 2020, 2021. This is 5 years ago. There have been 6 out of 400. That market
Wow,
is
okay.
dead. There are about 1,000 other alleged unicorns queuing up for a public floating, which isn't happening. Why? Because the rate of interest has gone up. The rate of interest isn't coming down. And people have seen through the nonsense. That, to go back to our friend Schumpeter, the disruptors get disrupted. So the disruptors who were disruptors 5 years ago are now mainstream. They're getting disrupted. So the mass extinction event will be the end of the la-la land around these unicorns. And what that will do, that will emasculate, I think we used the word castrate, John.
Right.
Talking about
Yes.
Viagra, right?
Yeah.
They will castrate the tech bros. You know, all those tech bro libertarians who were, going along with Trump because they thought, having become so rich on paper, that they were uniquely genius. And the idea of destroying the state that actually incubated them, because these kids were
Yeah.
educated in America. They were from America in the main. So the state that actually incubated them, they would destroy. Why? Because they're so rich, it must be due to their own genius. That will all evaporate like the dinosaurs in the mass extinction event, which is when the MAGA movement smashes into monetary economics and the brotocracy realizes that, frankly, most of those companies, as the evidence already suggests, are not worth the paper they're written on. And investors will get, I don't know, 20 cents on the dollar, 5 cents on the dollar, who knows?
Okay, sorry to stop you there, but if I understand this right, what the tech bros really need is low interest rates, as you say. But there is that other impending war that's going to take place now, which is between Trump and Jay Powell and MAGA and the Fed. How is that going to play out? Because they're going to be completely at odds with each other.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And this, again, is something that is clearly on the cards. So the Fed, for the MAGA people and for Trump, is kind of one of the old institutions. You know, it's one of the sort of the backbones of the American system. And of course, if inflation goes up as a result of tariffs and as a result of kicking out migrants, because the price of labor will go up, obviously, okay, and wages will go up.
Yeah.
If inflation goes up, the Fed has to actually raise interest rates. If Trump does not like that, there will be what they call financial repression, which is that they'll get rid of Jay Powell, they will put in somebody much more amenable to MAGA, as actually Nixon did with the Fed chairman Burns in the early 70s, and they will try and accelerate the growth rate of the economy. That, John, is Armageddon for the bond market. Okay?
Right.
And that, again, I think that should be not your risk case, that should be your central case. Because that's what they said they're going to do. There's one thing we know, maybe John would go here. There's one thing we know about Trump thus far, is he has to be taken seriously and literally. When he says he's going to do something, he does it. He had all these pledges before the election. People thought they were mad. We're going to have peace. We're going to abandon the Ukrainians if we have to. We're going to tell the Europeans they're not our mates. Everyone said, he won't do all that. What he says he's going to do, he does. Now, whether he sticks with it or not, that's a different thing. But he at least opens up those conversations. And the Fed will be yet another American institution that is definitely in the firing line of MAGA. And we just watch this space, John.